Okay, bones of the lower limb. By now, most of you have experience with the bones of the lower limb, and we left off with the knee joint and the patella specifically, which is one of the 3 joints at the knee. Technically, there are 3 joints at the knee. The patella, as some of you have seen in lab, is indispensable for normal knee extension. You saw the example with the pivot point and the elastic. The patella serves to leverage the mechanical advantage of the muscle at the knee. And this is our candidate sesamoid bone. Not really a shape that falls into any other category. It's triangular. It has a pointy apex and a flat base. And oddly enough, the apex is at the bottom and the base is at the top. And the articular surface you see at the back, it's one continuous surface, even though technically it's listed as 2. There are a medial and a lateral surface for articulation with the medial and lateral condyles, but it's one contiguous surface that tracks up and down along the articular surface for the patella and the femur. So indispensable for normal knee function. And I just want to take a moment to examine the knee. It's one of the most complex joints in the body. And to do that, I'll just introduce the bones of the lower limb, which I'm sure you know really well already, the tibia and the fibula. The femur articulates only with the tibia at the knee. The fibula is not involved. The fibula articulates inferiorly and laterally with the tibia. Distally, because we'll get there eventually, both bones do articulate at the ankle. Both of them do articulate with the talus, one of the tarsals, at the ankle. So they are both involved in the ankle joint, but not in the knee joint. Just the tibia and the femur, and of course the patella. And because the stabilizing structures of the knee are going to be important in our discussion, it's important to review, reiterate, acknowledge the point of insertion for all of the quadriceps muscles across the knee is at the tibial tuberosity. It's a large raised eminence just inferior to the superior surface of the tibia. And it's the start of the shin as well. You'll notice there's a large spine that comes down anterior through the length of the tibia. We'll get to that eventually, but it really originates just inferior to the tibial tuberosity. So you can kind of see why I mentioned earlier on that the knee is technically 3 joints. You see 2 of them here. There's technically 2 joints, one lateral and one medial, as each epicondyle articulates with the superior tibial surface. But we think of the knee as one joint. It's a modified hinge joint that allows a little bit of rotation when the knee is flexed, but mostly just flexion and extension. So let's explore the knee. And this will be a more in-depth conversation like we did with the shoulder joint. Being one of the most complex joints in the body, one of the most often injured joints in the body, and often the most difficult to repair joints in the body, I think an understanding of the knee joint is pretty crucial. So we have the 2 condylar joints that we just articulated, or that I just pointed out, and then the patella is the 3rd of the 3 knee joints, if you want to be technical. The patella makes a patellofemoral joint on the anterior surface. Now I'm showing you these pictures. I'm going to lead you through a discussion with the app overhead to explore the stability of the knee joint. We often think ACL, PCL, the menisci, and that's about it. But there's a lot more to the knee joint, and we see that shown here. Anterior and posterior views, and we'll get into the deep components eventually. There are 6 main superficial components and 3 deep components that stabilize the knee. And so I'm leading you through those, and you should probably make note of them. So let's just examine the knee specifically, and I have 2 examples here. One with all of the structures intact, the other with a more open and deep view at the knee. So the left knee here has all of the superficial stabilizing structures intact. There we go. And the first and most obvious structure is anteriorly this patellar ligament. The patellar ligament is the combined, it's the tendons of the quadriceps muscle that attach to the patella, and then since technically between the patella and the tibia it's bone on bone, it's called a ligament at that point. The patellar ligament has a massive role in stabilizing the knee anteriorly. So big role in stabilizing the knee anteriorly. And you see the tendon above as it crosses the patella, which is that eminence, that bulge in the middle, becomes the patellar ligament. So the patellar ligament, the first and most obvious. What's less obvious, that we often overlook, are the retinacula. There are 2 retinacula, medial and lateral, which are projections of some of the fascia that cover the quadriceps muscles and the muscles of the thigh. So we have a nice view here. There are 2 heads, but we're just considering this as the lateral patellar retinaculum. And that's complemented on the medial side by the medial patellar retinaculum. And they have both the ability to stabilize anteriorly and somewhat laterally, medial laterally. They're oblique. They're at an angle at the knee joint. We don't often think about these, but they're extensions of the fascia that span the knee joint to help stabilize the knee. Then as we move around, we see some usual suspects, more familiar faces. The collateral ligaments. Collateral ligaments are clearly medial and lateral support. So here the medial collateral ligament, or tibial in this case. You'll see it labeled as tibial on your slides as well. This is the MCL, medial collateral ligament. And that is complemented laterally by this very tiny, relatively, LCL, lateral collateral ligament. Or as you'll see it on this and on your slides, fibular collateral ligament. Same thing. But notice, it forms essentially a cage all the way around the front half of the knee. Should be pretty stable. At the back, we don't have as many tendons. There are a few muscles that cross the knee joint. They don't cross directly over the middle of the knee joint. There's a hollow in the middle of the knee, and I'll articulate that when we get to the muscles. But we do have 2 rather broad ligaments. 2 rather broad ligaments that help to secure the back of the knee. This one is the oblique popliteal ligament. And the name doesn't make a whole lot of sense at first until I tell you that depression, the fossa in the back, is the popliteal fossa. There's a hollow in the back of the knee that you can feel. You can feel tendons on either side, and then just a space. It's the popliteal fossa. And so this broad ligament coming from the lateral femur to the medial head of the tibia, obliquely at an angle, stabilizes the back of the knee joint. And it has a little bit of help from the arcuate ligament. Similar origin, lateral condyle of the femur, but it goes straight up and down. It connects at the head of the fibula. These are the two main ligaments that secure the back of the knee. One oblique and one vertical on the lateral aspect. So it seems like there's a lot less support on the posterior aspect of the knee. So we need a lot of musculature in that area, hopefully strong musculature to secure it. And then lastly, of course, because this is a synovial joint, synovial capsule. Synovial capsule, which you can see extends all the way around, surrounds the patella, deep to the knee, deep to all the ligaments, but doesn't provide as much structural rigidity as the ligaments do that we just discussed. Little support, mostly to contain the synovial fluid and keep the joint lubricated. Ligaments, by far, the biggest factors in stability. So six things. The patellar tendon, both retinacula, both cruciate ligaments, oblique popliteal ligament, arcuate ligament, fibrous capsule. And those are superficial. There's more as you dive a bit more deeply. So this view of the knee is with everything, mostly everything, removed. And I didn't remove the collateral ligaments to give you a sense of what we often think about as the knee. The models in lab have most of these intact. I think some PCLs are missing. But there isn't nearly as much, there aren't as many support structures as we just saw in the last example. So we know the lateral and medial collateral ligaments. The intrinsic ligaments of the leg are the ACL and the PCL. And those make up two of the three intrinsic connections or stabilizing structures of the knee, ACL and PCL. And they're named for their point of attachment on the tibia. PCL attaches posteriorly on the tibia, shown here. This is a posterior view. You can see the ACL because it originates all the way at the front, the anterior surface of the tibia, named for their attachment to the tibia proper. So PCL, really important for walking down stairs or down hills. It prevents the femur from sliding forward on the knee. We have a lot of other ligaments that do that as well, but this ligament specifically prevents the femur from sliding forward. ACL, on the other hand, does the opposite. Prevents the femur from sliding back or the tibia from sliding out from underneath it. And prevents hyperextension. Or should ideally prevent hyperextension. Now you can see the connections a bit more clearly if we remove the femur, and then you also get a sense of the third structure, which we've already discussed when we introduced joints to begin with, the menisci. There's a lateral and medial meniscus. Little wedges around the articular surfaces of the femur that secure the femur on top of the tibia and keep it centered. Now these will wear down with age or with injury. What's not shown here is they look pretty distinct. And the lateral meniscus is its own intact meniscus. It's attached to the bone only. But the medial meniscus, and it's not shown here, is connected to the MCL. It has a very close connection with the MCL and the ACL. These are all connected by fascia within the knee. And they often are also injured together for that reason. They are all connected, referred to as the unhappy triad. When the MCL is ripped or popped or torn, often the medial meniscus is torn as well, and that can even lead to damage of the ACL. It's not shown here like I would like it, but this area here that didn't quite work out. That area there is connected. The MCL and the medial meniscus are connected. So many structures, intrinsic structures, anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments, and both menisci. So you've seen that on the slides that you have in this depiction. Very similar views to what we just looked at. All the usual suspects are present here. And I didn't miss any points that I wanted to bring up. So really complicated. Lots of individual parts that try to keep the knee stable. Which works in a lot of cases. ACL, unfortunately, is one of the ligaments that's most prone to injury. And oddly enough, more often than not, it's injured in women than in men. There's a higher incidence of injury in women than in men. And the book does a nice little discussion of this, but at a conference that I was at a year ago, there's a really nice exploration of the force placed on the ACL during standing box jumps and lateral quick cuts. And there's no real reason why the ACL is weaker in women than in men. There's a couple theories. Some of the musculature around the knee is a little bit weaker in women than in men, or we think there might be hormonal influences that make the ligaments a bit more labile in women than in men. The joint's a little tighter, there's less room to move, but there's a consistent higher rate of injury in women than in men with regards to the ACL, which is unfortunate for you ladies in the crowd, I suppose. Might be a prompt to help secure the musculature of the knee to prevent that. So we move on now. The tibia and the fibula are no strangers. Tibia and the fibula, whoa, I jumped way ahead. A lot of the structures here I've already listed. The main points I want to bring out for you are the tibial tuberosity. We have the membrane down the middle, the interosseous membrane, like we saw with the radius and ulna to secure the bones together. But the tibia is the weight-bearing bone. The tibia is the weight-bearing bone, and hence it's larger, it's more central, much more stable. And though it does the primary job of bearing the weight at the lower leg, the fibula, you can see here, does articulate at the ankle somewhat. But again, most of that weight is distributed and handled by the tibia proper. So at the ankle bone, at the ankle joint, not the ankle bone, there's not one ankle bone. The tibia and the fibula articulate with what we call the talus, one of the tarsals. Like in the hand, We have a number of tarsals at the ankle joint, or the lower leg's wrist joint, that meet with metatarsals and phalanges. Only there are 7 tarsals here and not 8 like in the hand. But I'm not going to ask you to remember all their names. All I want you to remember are talus, the point of articulation at the ankle with the tibia and the fibula, and the calcaneus, which is the heel tarsal. You don't need to remember the first, second, and third cuneiforms, the navicular bone, the cuboid. Okay. You don't need to remember those, just the talus and the calcaneus. There are a lot of similarities with the bones of the foot. If you've studied the hand, this should be no surprise. It shouldn't be anything new and strange. The metatarsals, again numbered from the largest digit to the smallest digit. The direction is opposite here. Where in the hand they were labeled laterally heading medial because of the anatomical position. Here they're labeled medial heading lateral. So that's opposite, but it's from the largest digit. From the thumb in the case of the hand, and the big toe in the case of the foot. And these make up the body of the foot. So they end right at the ball of the foot. Where if you were to stand on the ball of the foot and stand up on your tiptoes, you'd be standing essentially on the end of the metatarsals. Distal, where you make the toes, again, are phalanges. 2 on the big toe, 3 in the small toes. Proximal, middle, and distal accordingly. Proximal, middle, and distal accordingly. So you have the mnemonic here if you want to remember the names of the tarsals, but I'm not going to require that. You already have to remember the carpals in the hand. This is similar. It's not anything new. And the phalanges, that's what I skipped ahead. The phalanges, proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. The diagram that you have here really underplays the importance of the organization of these bones and the arches in the foot. It looks like it's two-dimensional and flat. In reality, practically, as you sit there now, there's a large curvature. There's 2 main curvatures to the foot. One is longitudinal and one is transverse. And they act to provide spring when you're stepping. So they're not static. They compress and then rebound with every step to help propel you forward. And you can see, I'm not going through these in so much depth, but you can see the complexity of the ankle joints and the feet shown here. Notice again there's flexor and extensor retinacula. A lot of the tendons are shown here. And the arch specifically of the foot that rebounds and helps you walk, helps propel you forward. It's the sole of the foot made by the metatarsals at the ball of the foot where the phalanges begin. And we're not going through in depth the names of these ligaments, but you can appreciate the importance of the foot and the structures involved in supporting it. All these individual little ligaments that keep the tarsals together. All I want you to remember are talus, major point of articulation, and calcaneus, the heel bone at the back. So we've zipped through the bones, and now onto muscles. We want to talk about some of the muscles in the lower limb. And it's really hard to find a good picture to describe the muscles of the pelvic floor and perineum. That's appropriate for class, But remember I said that one of the greatest successes of the pelvis is to have the open outlet, yet nothing falls out. It's thanks to these muscles that we're going to explore in a bit of depth that occurs. The pelvic floor primarily is maintained by the pelvic diaphragm. Pelvic diaphragm. There's some fascia that stretches across the inside of the pelvis as well, but across the outlet, the inferior aspect of the pelvis, is a floor of muscle. Floor of muscle that maintains the contents of the pelvic cavity. So you can imagine what it looks like stretching from the pubis anteriorly to the coccyx at the back, and then on either side, the pelvic diaphragm itself doesn't connect specifically to the bone of the pelvis. There are two aponeuroses, or fascial sheets inside the pelvis that connect to it, and I'll show you those in a second. So this is what we're looking at. This is the pelvic diaphragm. All the muscles shown here from an inferior point of view. And the pelvic diaphragm, the pelvic floor, is all about levator ani. All about levator ani. Named for its action and its subject. To elevate the anus and other structures. Levator ani. All about levator ani. And there's 3 individual muscles that you can pick out of that pelvic floor. So this whole structure is levator ani. That whole structure is levator ani. And it's the only muscle that covers the entire floor. So it's of vital importance for maintaining things in their proper compartments. Now that said, some structures need passage. They can't contain everything completely. Some structures need passage. We need to defecate and urinate, excrete bodily waste. And so there are small ports, small portals, small holes for the rectum shown centrally. And this is a female pelvis, the urethra a bit more anterior. And in the female pelvis, the vagina as well is a portal through levator ani. More details on that as we get to the reproductive section. Bless you. But as part of the pelvis, important to talk about now. So the floor is all about levator ani. And we'll talk about the muscles briefly in a second. I also want to point out ischio-coccygeus. Ischio-coccygeus. It's hard to imagine from this slide, and it's not shown very well, but it's sort of the back support of the floor. From the ischial bones, the ischial tuberosities, to the coccyx, it's the back half of the pelvic diaphragm. And I'll show you how it's arranged in 3D coming up. All about levator ani with the assistance of ischio-coccygeus. Both of these are required to support structures normally, contract in response to any forced evacuations or internal spikes in pressure, sneezing, coughing, vomiting, other forced evacuations that are a bit messier and less straightforward. These have to contract and maintain that pelvic floor for all of the internal goods to stay intact. The lower intestines, the rectum, etc. Come back to another point in a second. All of these, conveniently, are innervated by one set of nerves, named nerve to levator ani. It's going to be easy to remember. Nerve to levator ani. Comes off of the sacral plexus. If you remember way back when we discussed this in the vertebral column and spinal cord section, the final plexus, one of the final plexuses in the spine is the sacral plexus. Nerve to levator ani innervates all of these structures. So I want to show you what it looks like. This is the pelvic floor, the pelvic diaphragm, with some of the other aspects removed that were on the other slide. And let's spin this fellow around real quick. You can see our muscles of the pelvic floor, iliococcygeus and pubococcygeus. Those are responsible for the foundational work of the pelvic diaphragm. Those keep the floor intact. You don't see the third muscle here because it's shown at the bottom. On your slides, it's called puborectalis. Here, it's puboanalis. Similar name, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. This has less of a role in maintaining the pelvic floor and more of a role in maintaining the integrity of the sphincter, preventing unnecessary opening of the sphincter. We want this muscle to work properly and be intact. And luckily, for the most part, it is. Hopefully, for almost all of the parts, it is. So this is the odd muscle out, puborectalis or puboanalis. Not so much a role in maintaining the pelvic floor, but in helping to regulate the activity of the anal sphincter. Now, while we're here, I want to show you the orientation of ischiococcygeus. Let's do right and left. So on the slide that you have, it looks like it's another layer. It's more superficial, but it's really the back or the posterior part of the bowl, the posterior part of the pelvic floor. So ischiococcygeus here, again, innervated by the same nerve, doesn't do as much of the weight-bearing activity as the pelvic diaphragm. It's more in helping to return the sacrum and the coccyx back to normal in a situation where it's been displaced. Childbirth, fantastic example. The book also talks about defecation in the same breath. I don't know what kind of bowel movements they're discussing in the book to have to reset the coccyx and the sacrum. But if you had to, it would be this muscle, coccygeus. Or sorry, ischiococcygeus, same thing. Ischial spine to the coccyx. Remember, that was one of the landmarks that we talked about last class. Ischial spine. Yeah, good stuff. So what about the perineum? Perineum is one layer superficial, or one layer inferior to the pelvic diaphragm. It's not supporting the contents of the pelvic cavity. It's on top of. I like superficial better. It's one layer superficial to the pelvic diaphragm. It's diamond-shaped, and you can break it up into anterior and posterior sections, both with different functions and activities, and covers a similar area as the pelvic diaphragm, but it doesn't connect to the internal fascia. Being a layer more superficial, it connects directly to the bone. Muscles of the perineum. And there are three. We won't talk about them in as much detail, but just in general. We can see here, for contrast and comparison, the inferior view of the male pelvic diaphragm. This is in contrast to the slide that I just showed you. A lot of the same muscles are present here. Major difference in the reproductive organs. You see the penis anteriorly cut in this case. Unfortunate for this model. The perineum itself is this area. One layer superficial, inferior or below the pelvic diaphragm, and broken into two triangles. There are anterior and posterior triangles, or urogenital and anal triangles of the perineum. And these muscles are support muscles. They support function of the urogenital muscles, the reproductive organs, and the anal sphincter posteriorly. So they are I'm debating on whether to make you remember these in a lot of detail. I think just remember the overall action of the perineal muscles, the individual names, because they're pretty divergent. I'm not going to require you to know. They're ischiocavernosus, bulbospongiosus, and the superficial transverse perineal muscle. We'll get back to these in the reproductive organ section, so you will know them eventually, but for right now, consider those muscles of the perineum. Muscles of the perineum. And let's call their main functions to help expel and clamp off the urethra. So expel urine and clamp off the urethra. These two anteriorly. And then the transverse muscle helps to clamp off and stabilize the anal sphincter. Both have to do with securing the excretion of waste products from the body. Two, with the anterior muscles associated with reproductive organs. One of them supports the anal sphincter posteriorly, the superficial transverse perineal muscle. Innervation here is pretty intuitive as well. Innervation here, perineal nerve. Muscles of the perineum, innervated by the perineal nerve. Levator ani, innervated by nerve to levator ani. Perineal muscles by the perineal nerve. Easy. All three of them innervated by the same muscle. Innervated by the same nerve, not the same muscle. So let's take a quick look just in contrast, so you can imagine the function of these muscles in relation to the pelvic floor, the pelvic diaphragm, like we just discussed. The transverse perineal muscles, ischiocavernosus, and this is obviously male specimen, bulbospongiosus here. The anterior muscles involved in function of the urethra, and then posterior, I'm going to say function of the sphincter. It's technically stabilizing the perineal body. You can see that cross point just anterior to the sphincter. It stabilizes that to keep the sphincter elevated and intact, but we'll call it regulation of the anal sphincter. So let's leave it there for today. Big muscles come next. Muscles of the femur, some of the largest, most powerful muscles in the body. We'll round out the muscles of the lower limb and then start our discussion about skeletal muscle in general.